Hello and welcome to today's virtual event. I'm Nick Hart, President and CEO of the Data Foundation. This is a really important conversation about the future of financial regulatory reporting. We're excited you're here to join us. Today, we're at an inflection point. Just a few years ago, the Financial Data Transparency Act was signed into law back in 2022. 9 federal financial regulators were mandated to develop common machine-readable data standards. Here at the Data Foundation, we've long been a supporter of that law, along with our Data Coalition members. A joint rule has been proposed. The current administration has indicated that these regulations remain on the joint regulatory agenda, and that's an important signal about where we are in the current moment. And now it's the really hard point, or sorry, the hard part, the collection by collection implementation. So one key point that I'd like to just stress at the outset of our discussion today, the FDTA, it's not just about compliance, it's about building a regulatory data infrastructure that ultimately reduces burden, improves oversight, and we think delivers quality data that informs better decisions. So why does this matter for all of us? There's 3 key reasons the timing matters in our work. First, it's about regulatory efficiency and government effectiveness, topics that are near and dear to all of us, hopefully. The Data Foundation, we've partnered and really committed to supporting and advancing the FDTA and its implementation. Why does that matter? It aligns with important efficiency goals that are top of mind for a lot of folks in government and outside government, not just in 2025, but in years past and years to come. Standardized and interoperable data equal less duplicative reporting, fewer contradictory requirements, and lower long-run costs. So this is not just about more regulation. We think it's about smarter regulation. Second, there's a fundamental need for all of these things in 2025 and beyond. We need high-quality data that improves society and it improves business. And we think the FDTA is but one of the critical steps to do just that. Third, we can learn from others. You're going to hear more about this in our discussion today. Australia, the Netherlands, parts of Europe. Some have exceeded brilliantly, even though some got stuck. And we're going to talk about what that all means. Today, we're releasing a new report, The Reality of SBR 2.0, Streamlined Data. This is a partnership with Donnelley Financial Solutions, a report that was co-authored by our Chief of Staff, Ashley Nellie Davis and Mark Dangelo, who you'll hear from in just a moment. So what is this? It's not just a white paper about why standardization is good. It's a practical roadmap. It's an excellent roadmap, I'd add, with international case studies identifying some capability gaps around technology, people, and governance. There's a 5-stage implementation framework and specific calls to action for regulators, filers, and technology providers. The central argument of this piece that we're going to talk about throughout our discussion today is that FDTA provides building blocks. SBR, or Standardized Business Reporting, is a vision for how those blocks can fit together. So without coordination, and we're big believers here at the Data Foundation of this need for better coordination, there's a risk for building slightly different systems across agencies instead of one interoperable ecosystem or a useful way of bringing the data together. So we can do better, much better, and this report is going to provide a strategy for a path forward. So here's what we're going to do today. First, we're going to hear some opening remarks from Craig Clay, who is the president of Donnelley Financial Solutions. And I'm going to have a quick conversation with Craig about what regulators can do right now. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with Mark, one of the co-authors, and Bridget Hughes from Donnelley Financial. And then we'll have some interaction with all of you as participants who are joining us live with questions that you may have. And I want to encourage you, if you're joining us live, to ask your questions at any time during today's conversation. So with that, I want to turn to Craig, who offers an opening set of remarks in the report itself and stresses better decisions, not more burden, as part of that opening set of remarks, and really stress that progress depends on people and technology working together. So with that framing, Craig, I want to turn it to you for your opening remarks.
Thanks, Nick. It would be less burden is what we're going for. So welcome to the webcast. It's great to be here to hear the discussion of the reality of standard business reporting and its impact on data transparency. We at Donnelley are believers in the mission, the Data Foundation. We're OG members. We really believe that this can make a better government and a better opportunity for us to have transparency. We are proud to sponsor the white paper 2.0 SBR. And really thank you for joining us as we work together to shape the future of regulatory data and unlock new opportunities for progress. So Nick, back to you.
All right, Craig. So yes, want to stress less burden. Sorry if I said that wrong. In DFIN's message, you wrote at the beginning of the report, I'm going to quote this: "If the rollout does not align with SBR principles, the U.S. risks codifying redundancies and unnecessary cost." So I'm sort of trying to stress here that we're at this critical juncture for implementation. We had this joint rule that was proposed that the Data Foundation submitted comments on. It's not yet finalized, but we're hoping that it will be finalized soon, and agencies will then adopt some standards for each respective collection. What do you think is the single most important action that the regulatory community, the regulators, actually need to take in the next 12 months to avoid locking in those redundancies that you were writing about? What do you think that is?
Yeah, Nick, you hit on it in your opening remarks, which is it's the hard part. So the single most important action that regulators need to take in the next 12 months is to prevent these redundancies and unnecessary costs in the FDTA rollout. So regulators need to publish and harmonize interoperable taxonomies aligned with SBR principles. That has to be done in the next 12 months. We need them validated through staged pilot programs, which would be great to see and get input from the users before we have full implementation. Early taxonomy alignment is going to ensure that consistencies across agencies. It's going to allow us to reuse the data to the point of our earlier comments of making it easier. It's going to avoid siloed frameworks that increase complexity and compliance burden. It's going to be great to use the same data across many reporting needs. So today, I think we've got the white paper, we've got Mark, we've got Bridget from DFIN. Sorry to hear Ashley couldn't be on the call today. She's a critical member of the Data Foundation. So thank you to Ashley in her absence. But excited to hear more about how regulators can take the next 12 months to do those things.
Great. Well, Craig, again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you again for DFIN support. And with that, I want to turn next to invite Bridget and Mark to join. And let's dive in on some of the substance of the paper itself and the next steps. And Bridget, I want to maybe start with you and get a little bit more perspective, building on Craig's remarks, to start with the regulated entities perspective about what all of this means. The report describes SBR 2.0, as we've been talking about, moving from regulatory compliance to this concept of regulatory data consistency. So for somebody who's, for example, a chief compliance officer or a CFO hearing about the FDTA for the first time, we don't want to pretend that everybody knows what this is. We have a lot of work to do in explainability still. What does that shift actually mean for how they're going to manage reporting? What does that look like?
Sure. Well, regulated entities are the ones that really will benefit from the submit once, use everywhere model. So rather than just reporting, they'll be mapping their reporting data. So whether it's financial, sustainable, whichever data they have, to common vocabularies and taxonomies. They'll be validating at the source, generating machine readable submissions that can be reused across many reporting obligations and to many different agencies. You've referenced in the FSOC, the 9 FSOC agencies that are in the FDTA proposed rule. In this paper, it's designed to move from why and to show how. So offering practical steps and checklists. There are numerous graphics that we'll be able to review that'll illustrate how to transform the regulatory reporting from fragmented processes into a connected, standards-driven environment. And then certainly, I think as what Craig was just really alluding to is the common taxonomies first. These people really need to dig in and understand what their data is and then how to align it to common taxonomies.
Yeah, that's great. And Mark, I maybe want to continue building on this idea. You're right that standards without skill set transformation results in misalignment. And so maybe before I continue, I'll say thank you also for contributing and writing, co-authoring the report. So there's some really excellent visuals in the report. One that jumps out at me is this, it's figure 3, shows all of the shifting roles for folks like chief data officers and the risk officers, compliance officers, IT leaders. Now, for folks that are seeing this on screen right now, yes, it's going to be a little hard to process. There's a lot going on here. They can download it on our website. If you're tuned in live, there's a link in the chat. If you're watching this after the fact, of course, you've got the link there too. What's the biggest capability gap that you're seeing organizations struggle with right now? And also, please help folks understand this chart.
Sure, sure. Well, first, thank you for letting me be here. If you look at how this chart came to be, this chart was actually an implication of how we approach this report. When Bridget, Ashley, and myself started contemplating this back in June, July, and August, and we created it and started writing it up, it became something that we said, not everybody, to your point, Nick, has the same definition of what FDTA is. What is it? It's 2022. It was originally, thought about back in, when the Data Act was passed in 2015. SBR was around 2017. You begin to look at all these ideas of principles of how regulation should be. And we said, maybe we should start building this report a little bit differently. And so we actually built the appendices first. We said, let's go to the foundation of FDTA. Then we said, what is the definition of SBR? Because again, we had the Netherlands, the EU, the Australia. We had 20 years of history. We said, okay, now what does that mean for the US? My recollection back in, was it 2017, 2018, Nick, you and the Data Foundation with Price Waterhouse produced a report talking about structured business reporting back in the early days. And we said, that's great, but it has changed. It has evolved. Technology's come a long way. And with that, then we said, okay, we have the foundations for FDTA. We have SBR in terms of what they should do, their purpose in regulatory compliance and regulatory reporting. And then we said, gee, now how do we assess that? And that was Appendix C that kind of came first before we ever started looking at saying, now what should we recommend to folks? Oftentimes you see these reports, and the audience knows this as well. You look at these things and they're like academic research papers. They're footnoted, they're footnoted here, footnoted there, this reference and that reference, and that's great. But the reality for many folks in industry, like myself, we began to say, okay, now what does that mean to me? How do I actually do something with this versus sounding like a bunch of, academics or government employees or even reference folks that basically say, where do I begin? And so that's where this diagram really started coming in. It was an implication of the general principles of why regulation, why FDTA, SBR, and stuff are important, but also the rationale of saying, okay, if we adopt this, that means the building blocks. That means interoperable type of semantic definitions for our data. That means taxonomies and all this wonderful stuff we throw out in the industry. But then we said, what does that do to the roles and responsibilities, the contextualization of how do we apply FDTA and SBR? And that's what this diagram really is. And that's why you see on the outside of this diagram, the Data Act from 2017, FDTA from 22, and yet to be passed SBR 2.0 or the next iteration here in the US. And it says this is going to impact the typical roles. And why do we have all these roles on the left side and the FDTA and so forth and the key consideration? Because what has happened over time, and we know this from regulatory compliance, it does not get simple, it gets more complex. And as that complexity starts to come in from data, from regulations, from different agencies, the 9 that are referenced in FDTA, we have to ask ourselves, how do we break this apart and actually do something with it? It's like you can't take everything at once and say, I'm gonna tackle this whole thing and not have a starting point. So what we see here are actually these ability to break this up into different components. It's called a layering mindset. is that we can have the technology, we can have fintech and regtech and all this other wonderful technology that automates an efficiency for the total process itself. But we really have to say, what does that do to the people? How can we audit this? How can we make it immutable? And that's really what you begin to see, is that the roles and responsibilities, the accountability for each of these folks begins to change. And it becomes this layering process of everybody has to work together because the data is no longer siloed. It is cross-functional. And that is really what this diagram begins to reference.
Yeah, I love, Mark, the visual that this also creates about the ecosystem. And the first figure actually in the report really lays this out. However, one question for you that I'd be curious if you could walk through. I mean, years ago, we didn't have the role of chief data officers in government. And I think just the imagination of how the CDO cuts across all these functions is exactly how the role was envisioned to work, but also as a collaborator with all of these other positions. It's really hard to do. It's costly. It's time intensive. But you've laid this out really nicely as a visual. Can you just quickly give us that delineation for a CDO? What's their role here, and how does it cut across those different responsibilities?
The CDO, in essence, becomes the enterprise architect for data. I mean, let's put it into a common traditional term. The enterprise architect used to be a individual or group of individuals that were the caretakers of the whole technology, the infrastructure, if you will. The data has become so high volume, so variety based, so different, componentized in terms of its nuances, that somebody has to do that distinction, and the CDO cuts across the applications. This is a difference of idea between a process definition, what we used to talk about for regulatory tech, an application being a customer relationship management or ERP or whatever the system was that was the operational system of record. People were very focused and skilled in that, but the problem is the data and the technology was encapsulated within those silos. The CDO begins to cross those silos, especially in a government sense and cross of agencies, because they need a common definition. I don't need, if I'm a CDO within a government or even a CDO within an industry, I don't need 10 different or 100 different definitions of the idea of customer. Who is that customer? What are they do? Where does that data come from? When was it last changed? Who had the authority to change it? The CDO makes sure that that information that cuts across these cross-functional systems, these cross-functional regulations, is the same information. And the lineage of that CDO, he or she can track that all the way back. It's no longer let's do an extraction transformation load, put it into a warehouse, put it into a mark, and we begin to operate on that. The problem is every time we do that, we often lose the true lineage, because if the original source information, and I'm being a CDO, if that changes, how do I know, or when do I know that information is replicated across the various siloed technology that is driving the regulations? This is where the CDO's roles and responsibilities now start to, I don't want to use the word encroach, but they're actually cooperative with all these other ones, because I was an old CIO and CTO. I mean, that's what I started my career as. I didn't have a great understanding of that, even when the systems were encapsulated. Now, when data is measured in zeros of 10 to 23, with 23 zeros on a yearly basis that we're generating around the globe, from mobile devices to our actually operational systems, structured data, that is a huge amount of information for one person to deal with. And that's why this is now in layers. And the CDO has their responsibilities, their operational capabilities to say, this is something I am accountable for. I will make sure that the organization has consistency. And this is why the CDO is so important.
Yeah, I love it. You've given us a perfect setup to talk a little bit now about implementation. And Bridget, I want to turn to you, because certainly there are companies that are already thinking about, what do I do when it comes to implementing these rules? We've seen the draft. We have not seen a final regulation, obviously, still in the works from the federal government. But what are some things that companies or regulated entities might start thinking about if they're interested in taking actionable steps right now in 2025 or early 2026? As they position themselves? Do you have some thoughts on what they could do?
Yes, and you're right. There's not much left of 2025. We're already, I would say, 12 months behind the ball, right? We thought that we would be finalizing the rule by December 2024, and we'd be kind of into implementation. But I think in this white paper, there's a checklist down in Appendix C that Mark was talking about, and it really talks about the 4 ways that companies can start to prepare for the FDTA rollout. And that is looking at the data and the readiness, maybe your data strategy and your approach to the data, organizational readiness, and then change management and monitoring it. Building working groups internally at companies, for SEC filers, we've, you could leverage the learnings from, when you started your annual tagging or your quarterly tagging back in 2009. It was a new way of identifying definitions and going through the taxonomy. That is really kind of where you start, and then taking a look at the other FSOC agencies. Where else do you as an entity have to report to? And even what data do you have and capture that could potentially be interesting, not just to regulatory agencies, but third parties? And I'm probably going to say the ESG word, but back when it was an initiative, people were really thinking about sustainable data and how do they integrate sustainable data in with their financial data. So that's just one example of different pieces of data that can be identified, monitored, audited, and tagged along the way. So I would say companies should be looking in the next 12 months at what data do they have, what is going to be reportable, and just really kind of get themselves organized and use that checklist in the back of the paper.
Yeah, great suggestion. And I maybe highlight you are allowed to say the term ESG. California in the United States
That's right.
has its
Kept it
law.
alive.
There's a proposal in New York. There's for multinational organizations reporting abroad. And it is a reality of if we're going to have reporting, we should have good data that's associated with it. In that spirit, Mark, I want to turn to you. Bridget invoked Appendix C. So for folks tuning in, you can check this out. But I'm curious, specifically, there's some surprises that can come up in these lists. And sometimes we think when we're doing our baseline assessments, we might have everything figured out. It's the knowable. What do you think are those common surprises that people have figured, that they think they have something figured out, but they really don't? What do you see when you approach this?
Oftentimes, and it's like, I'd love to say there's an easy answer to this, but it often depends on the industry and the organization themselves and the systems they're using. However, if you look at this and you look at the 4 checklists, from the change management, the organizational to the data infrastructure, the real one that often comes up the most is the change management. And why does that? I mean, change management sounds like we're putting new software systems in. But the reality is, in a data world, a data-driven type of a solution for regulatory compliance, data change management is often the thing that we don't think about, because oftentimes when we look at software, how we do software from regulatory compliance, it's about making the horse run faster. It's the efficiency, if you will. You can see the horses behind me. I have a horse run. So you begin to see this and say, so the horse can run faster, but the problem is where did it come from? How do I track what it's done? And change management is often the challenge with regards to data, which then goes back into the metadata, which goes back into the standards. And you can begin to see how this Appendix C is linked. But the change management mindset is something very different. And the obvious question most people would have is saying, yeah, okay, that's great. We put more policies and procedures or process around it, or assign a new person, or whatever the case may be. The reality is that what is happening, and we can use some analogies. Again, we don't have to say, oh, this is all brand new. We can take a look at the lessons learned from something as complicated and as visible today as information security, IT security. And everybody says that to me and says, I'm like, well, great. Is that cybersecurity or is that IT security within the organization? Which one are we talking about? And if you looked at the historical way we approached IT security, much like we did regulations, we did it within an application. We did it within a regulation. We did it within a data warehouse. that change management, that data infrastructure, the ability to go through those checklists says, you know, I am no longer in these individual application silos doing the checklist for bias and conformance and so forth. I need to go back, just like we do with IT security today. It is no longer vertical type of things that are within a application or a system or a tech stack or what have you. It is something that completely cuts across. And so when you look at Appendix C, you look at the weakest links, it's that ability of regulation that cuts across everything and says, that is a change management issue, because if I change it in one spot and it's got 10 different silos, when do I replicate it? How does it replicate? Can I go back and track? And this is the idea where we start to say, this is not a process-driven approach for applications. This is a data-driven approach where we have one version of the truth, which improves our quality, cuts our costs, and reduces the number of people we have to care and feed our whole regulatory compliance burden. And we call it a burden today because that's indeed what it is.
Yeah, Mark, for all of us who worked in government or in large institutions, this idea of change management was always so critical and yet so wickedly hard to do. So I, can't echo enough about how much what you're saying is at least resonating with me and hopefully with others. It's also bringing to mind maybe some of the examples of what we've seen in other countries about how complex and hard this can be to implement in practice. The Netherlands had what we considered gold standard, or they considered gold standard. It took decades to implement. Australia's journey for SBR was quite long as well. And here in the United States, we've got this very ambitious timeline for what we're talking about. It's just a couple of years. And I'd say the question here is really, is that too ambitious based on what we've seen in other countries? Bridget, what's your reaction to this based on what Mark's describing from change management? Do you think we're being overly optimistic? Is this pragmatic? Do we need to be more pragmatic?
Yes. I think I think it is overly optimistic. Yes, I think there is just so many variables in the US that that come into play. And just reading what had the case studies on the Netherlands and Australia, to me, that it seemed like it was pretty controlled. And I just don't think that word exists here. So yeah, that's my fear with the timeline that's in front of us.
So maybe Mark, I mean, same question to you, but like, can we compress this timeline also based on what you've seen?
I think the short answer is, of course we could compress that time frame. We don't need 10 years to 20 years to do it, because again, those organizations stopped and start, they regrouped, they did things. We should be able to learn from those lessons to do it. But to Bridget's point is that I think right now we are overly optimistic. It requires a centralized kind of a mindset. And we saw this with the EU. You mentioned Netherlands and Australia. Those two had centralized oversight and distributed or decentralized type of implementation across the industry. The EU, for instance, had a nice approach, 27 member countries. However, they have struggled with it because there is no centralized regulatory authority saying, you will do this, you will do it by when. You have a freedom as an agency to require these different semantics, different data types, different metadata tags, whatever you need, that's great. But the EU has shown that without that centralized approach and just hoping for the best, it's like clicking our heels in the Wizard of Oz and saying, I want to go home. It's the same kind of mindset. Without that, you cannot do that. And I think that is the challenge and the opportunity. But again, I'm a computer scientist by education and practice. I will tell you that if we do not, as the US, subscribe to an engineering mindset, which is a crawl, walk, run, build the prototype, do the pilot, then begin to do the production, we will never get there. And right now we are stuck. I hate to say it, we're stuck in that prototyping stage. We have the regulations, but we really haven't rolled this out into pilots. We haven't gotten industry feedback. Industry hasn't joined the march to say, I understand what you're saying. And if I think this through, where maybe regulatory compliance is costing 0.5% to 1.5% of the total operating expense to get different highly regulated industries. Sometimes that's even more. But if I look at that across the medium, small, and large enterprise, I begin to say, oh, that is a number that I'd love. Back to your efficiency and your opening remarks and Craig's opening remarks, is that we want to gain that efficiency. And the only way we can do this is design it from a prototyping, start with the data, and then look at all these ways we do extractions and processing and report augmentation and XBRL and JSON and all this wonderful stuff we talk about within the tech that the CDO begins to say, oh my God, what do I have to do? And then you got the CIOs and CTOs saying, who's got the budget? Is that a cloud provider? You begin to look at all these nuances. And I think that's where this complexity, that's where the ability to decompose this into layers of responsibility and accountability, back to our drawing of figure 3, is so key. Because if we don't recognize that and we assume that we're just going to go business as usual doing a regulatory compliance or a reg tech, that may be problematic with this volume of data with these different organizations. And you hate to say it, the change in things, just like the government shutdown, politics of the circumstances, industry circumstances, regulators, we cannot take that this is just going to be a snap of the fingers. Somebody's going to dictate and you're going to be there. They'll be in the courts for years before we get implementation one.
So Mark, I'm gonna beat your Wizard of Oz analogy to death. My son is a huge fan of the musical Wicked,
Yep.
and I think one of the takeaways from what you've just described to me is that there's much more to the story, just like Wicked being a prequel of
Mhm.
Wizard of Oz, and that context is so important for getting started. But most importantly, this takeaway is that yes, this is hard, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't get started. And that yes, the timeframes might be ambitious. I'm an eternal optimist, as my team knows, but we have to get started somewhere. So maybe let's turn now and talk for just a minute about some of these data architecture and technology distinctions that you actually write about and cover some of this ground in the report as well. You draw a really, I think, important distinction between what you call process ideation, so automating these paper-based processes, and data ideation,
Mhm.
building reusable data ecosystems. I found this really intriguing. Can you give us an example? Well, explain what you need to help everybody understand
Sure.
that, but give us a really concrete example of what that changes for companies making that shift.
Sure. Process ideation is the idea of system ideation. We've done this for computer scientists. And again, this is when I still had hair back in the day. I mean, this is where I came up with. And I remember these days because we were all focused about the application. What are the requirements? Can you tell me the user story? What's the ethic? Do you know the data model within the app? I mean, this is how we did process ideation. We created an application to make either a workflow or a manual process or whatever it was. And back in the day, it was paper-based, right? So we automated these paper-based flows. And that became the process ideation. It became how oftentimes we design systems back from the 60s all the way through even today. And the idea was that I'm going to automate requirement, I'm going to make it efficient, I'm going to make that horse run faster, back to that analogy. The idea with data analogy or data ideation says, what if I could turn our data into an actual product mindset? If you look at how we productize software, and this could be our vendors, this could be whatever, we often think about it in silos, addressing a regulation or an industry or a segment. What about all the data that is common across that? What about all the data that is contextually not transmittable from one point to another? But if we understand the semantics, we understand the taxonomies, then we can begin to say, oh, there are components where that works. There are components that when it doesn't. Data ideation basically says data is our asset. And again, that sounds so cliche nowadays. We've often thought about this, but data begins with the product rules. We can basically say that has rules around it. So I can go down to a data element, a data schema. I can go down to field levels. I can go down to constraints within the data between the fields and say, if I am true to that data, then I can take that data element, that schema, that taxonomy, and I can move it across different silos of processes. So the processes are drawing from one to another. And why is this important today? It sounds like a great big academic mindset or theory we can talk about. But the reality is, when you look at the events of the last 3 years, since 2022, since the FDA was actually passed, and this is interesting in my mindset, is that That was when, ChatGPT hit the thing. We talked about AI like mainstream, even though AI has been out there since the 60s. We began to look at this and say, oh, if I have that, I have these huge volumes of data, I can begin to make decisions. I can create these chatbots. And then we said in 23, oh, forget GPT, we have a new one. We have Gen AI with RAG, retrieval augmented generation. We can actually bring the operational data sets of the corporation in and make that Gen AI, those large language models and things that are in the news nowadays and NVIDIA talks about. We can talk about all this stuff and it becomes great. 24 hit and we started saying, oh, forget that's old scale, that's legacy already. Now we're talking about something called agentic AI, actually AI wrapped in compartments that have decisioning and they can communicate back and forth. And when you look at this, and now there's even a new one called agentic RAG, which is bringing the operational systems in to create these little autonomous things that are self-learning, that are goal-oriented, that message them back and forth without human intervention. So we're beginning to look at all this rapid cycling of technology. But what is AI? AI is driven by data. AI are data trained solutions, which goes back to the data ideation. Without data ideation, the idea of where corporations are going, where solutions from a productization standpoint are going to fail because they cannot support the number of people, the number of organizations, the number of processes, the number of checks and balances, the auditabilities. I mean, again, 3 years ago when Reuters brought me out to go talk to all the CEOs and directors of all the accounting agencies, they wanted to go AI. I said, well, being an old auditor, I'm going to ask you, how are you going to audit AI? And it was kind of this like, oh my God, there has to be a solution. And the only way you can audit this stuff is the data. The concrete example of this is that no longer am I going through all these procedures to create a report. Again, back to the paper-based mindset. We create an idea, we create a report it over. The idea here is that we get that reusability. So not only am I getting common data, I don't have all the costs of the data warehouses. I don't have the extraction transformation loads. I don't have the data staff that's actually trying to create the lineage. I don't have the audit oversight. I don't have the legal mandates that are trying to figure out. You begin to look at it just like we had figure 3 with all the roles and responsibilities, including the chief legal officer. You begin to look at this and say, I can now have concrete examples where I can rethink of how that data is used. I can standardize it, I can normalize it, and I can reuse it. So it's defined once, I reuse it everywhere. And there are actual physical solutions out there today. Came out in about 2019, all before this happened. These are things called advanced data architectures called data meshes, which are domain-centric, decentralized governance for people of interest. Those link to data fabrics. Data fabrics are the enterprise thing, the centralized control that we talk about in SBR. And then you call the data weaves, which are all the data ingestion. And the final point I'll give you here, Nick, that I thought was just, it's kind of interesting back to when I started this. In 2022, when FDA was passed, they didn't probably realize that what they were mandating on these building blocks, on these data components, on these segments, were actually the lifeblood, the blood that will feed agentic AI in the future. Because without that, we cannot, from an industry perspective, get agentic AI. We can't sustain it. It's just too big, too cumbersome, too much money. So it's kind of interesting that the passage of what our regulators did, whether they did this intentionally or had a crystal ball, is that they have set within these regulations the principles of operation that will feed our future AI systems. And nobody really kind of looks at that and says, oh, regulations are good. Well, regulations in this way can be a catalyst for us how we transform our business. So there are some operational things. It gets us out of the teams of reporting. It gets us out of silos of regulatory tech. It gets us out of silos of people porting data from one thing to another thing and manipulating it so we can report it.
Yeah, Mark, a really clear explanation of not just a bit of history, but the rapid evolution of this ecosystem. And I'd say actually maybe one of the most concise transitional ways of explaining this movement over just the last 4 or 5 years in the AI context. And Bridget, I'm going to turn to you because DFIN's been a long supporter of our work and also the sector's work on regulatory technologies. I think Mark set you up really nice to really just talk a bit for a couple of minutes about how some of the point solutions that are coming out of RegTech and have really been developed in recent years to do everything around extraction and transformation to support regulatory obligations that we've invested a lot in. You've invested a lot in. Companies are investing a lot in. But that's also rapidly evolving. The report talks about moving to taxonomy-defined data foundations, phrase I like as the head of the data foundation. And to do that as an alternative, but also sort of complementary in a way. What does that look like, and what does that mean to you? How do you make a business case for that when we've already invested in those point source solutions and regulatory technology?
Yes. So first, I think the best part of this paper is the new terminology that you'll learn. So the data fabric, the data weaving, the data meshes. It was just a great journey going through just how standard business reporting has changed from 2017 all the way to now. So, but I think moving away from, the fragmented process design, so including the different, standalone solutions that people are reporting to use it, having the data reusable, the taxonomy defined, both, public reporting institutions as well as the government agencies, the data becomes accurate, it becomes simplified. The data reported to and collected by the regulatory agencies is just so important to our economy. I think it just goes back to standardizing and tagging the data at the source is going to reduce the cost and the burden of data collection. It's not an exact parallel, but the reporting entities, and we've all just lived through the modernization of Edgar to Edgar Next. And while we leveraged the multi-factor authentication of login.gov, was it the most recent software? Was it, but no, but it was well known. It is consistent across agencies, so it's proven and it's widely accepted. I think leveraging machine readable format coupled with the defined taxonomies is leveraging proven format and language. And so I think, I don't think people will think of it as sunk costs then. And it's the right way to move forward.
Hey, Nick, and I have one more thing, and again, kind of just expanding on what Bridget had. Oftentimes, we look at these different solutions as kind of like different silos, right? And so we kind of look at those and say, okay, we're solving this reg, we're solving this reg, we're solving this reg. And last I saw from one of the law firms in New York, which basically said there are 15,000 or 18,000 state, federal, and local regulations that people are managing on a business basis, depending on your industry. And so you begin to look at that and say, even if it was 10%, that's a huge amount of regulation. So what happens with these systems that we already have today is that we take them from the silo components and we begin to create data meshes that basically say they have the common XBRL, they're linked through the XML extraction process. We may put JSON upon them. So then we begin to link them across. And so those sunk costs, that all that work that you did in advance is setting up for a next step. And so they're not like throwaway. You're just like, okay, we're throwing these out and we're coming with something new. No, we're leveraging those pieces very succinctly. All that work's been done because you've got these standards, the XBRL, the JSON, all that stuff. You begin to link them and say, now they're coming together, and now we can read these things with a fabric, much like stitching. I can begin to now create these, and I can cross the various regulatory silos, and I can bring them up. And that says then the weaves come in and they start feeding it, like just like they're doing consistently. We get a crawl, walk, run approach where we're not saying, let's start with something brand new. No, let's leverage what we've got, the experiential knowledge, the capability of those systems. Those systems will evolve without a doubt. They may change their databases, they may change their data structure. But now we're getting to a point where all that investment is not sunk costs like we used to think from an accounting standpoint. It's something that can actually be leveraged. And so whether it's a 1x or a 0.5x, it's going to be something that is better than starting from ground zero.
So let's talk about those international case studies for a minute. They've come up a few times, and maybe a good transition from what you were just characterizing there. So there's 3 case studies from around the world in the report. Folks can read those at depth. But Mark, I'd be curious to hear one big success out of the case studies, and then one lesson that we can take away from something that maybe didn't work so well in the case studies.
Well, I think if you look at one of the big successes is the number of data elements that all these different agencies were using. You could look at the Australian, you could look at the Netherlands. They were in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of discrete data elements that were going across the agencies. Those numbers were reduced sometimes by 30, 40 fold. They began to say, okay, we have the same semantics. We don't need all this data. They simplified their government understanding. And from a political or a corporate or even a national perspective, it's small government doing things with less. So we said we had more data, we had leverage data. I don't need all these folks to do this because we have consistency across them. And I think that's what they showed was that by doing that, they got greater efficiencies, not as just an organization, but industry also. They, by 4 or 5 years down the road, many of these things, Australia, Netherlands, EU hasn't gotten there, but they begin to say, hey, our industry folks are spending somewhere in the order of 20 to 45% less on regulatory compliance to our agencies than they did before. Now, that's a significant thing. Yes, you're going to have a blip to come up to it and get consistency, but the idea is that that long tail becomes very measurable for the industry leaders themselves, is that the burden has been lessened, even in highly regulated industries. So I think that was the lesson. The lesson also there was that you need centralized oversight for distributed or decentralized implementation. You can't govern everything from a centralized model, much like we couldn't do this from a computer systems back in the day and even today. You look at things like Amazon Web Services or Snowflake or something else like this, or any cloud provider. They are not centralized data centers. They are a multitude of centralization on top of decentralization. This is the data architecture. So they've set the foundation for us to do that. And I think the downside is that without a centralized oversight, without somebody saying, yes, I understand it's painful. Yes, I understand it's different. We don't like change as human beings and organizations. It's costly upfront, but you're going to have to do this because we can show in the long run that there's value. And the value was if you as industry do not participate with the government data folks or the oversight folks, and you're not actively involved. I think Bridget mentioned, get involved, get the committee set up, get the centers of excellence kind of built for your organization. If you're not doing that now, why the regulations are being finalized, you're going to be behind the curve. So your cost is going to go up and your value is going to go down. This is some of the lessons learned that we can take a look from these international case studies. Now, again, they're not linear that you can just cut and paste like a prescription and put them onto the US markets. But I think there are lessons there that basically say we have to do things differently, but at the same time, we can learn from others' mistakes. And that's where we look at this from the Australian and the Netherlands, and the Netherlands being kind of the gold standard, as we call them. There's some good examples of how this can be done. But there's also things like in the EU, we say, without that overlaid centralized government, without all these individual organizations, different countries, without that, they don't get traction real quick. And I think that's where the whole, back to the Bridget's idea of the time frame, being overly optimistic. Without that tip of the spear type of approach where somebody is leading the way for valid reasons, not just burden reasons, then we're going to struggle.
Well, Mark, I very much appreciate your comment of not just carbon copying the things that are happening in policies from other countries. Context, of course, in the United States matters a lot for how we design something that's appropriate for our context. In that spirit, Bridget, one of the things in one of the other countries that succeeded in Australia was not centralization, but the certification framework for software and some of the programs around things that helped build trust and some aspects of standardization. That jumped out at me in the case studies. I'm curious what you would think about the US considering that as part of the framework and what that might look like in the markets here.
Sure. So, my head jumps to like two things, one in the private sector, like LinkedIn Learning. You think about all of the certifications that go on with those courses. But then I think more of the practicality, and this goes back to what we've learned and lessons learned. I mean, XBRL US has a data quality committee. I mean, tags can be extended, even though there are defined tags, but the data quality committee goes and reviews on a regular basis, like, which tags are being used. Are they really the same tag, but people just have their own spin on it? So I think there's a couple of different ways we can do it. And I think whether it's the private sector or the public sector, we absolutely should do some sort of certification to build the trust, to hold people accountable, and to ensure that the data submitted is data that we can count on.
Okay. So we've built some rapport over our last 50 minutes together. In our final minutes together, I'm going to take us to some dangerous territory and talk about the deregulation paradox, as I'm going to call it. This is an era where we're back to what we might characterize as an age of deregulation across society at the state level, at the federal level. There's a lot of agencies at the national level, but also across many states that are having reduced budgets, reduced capacity, or changing capacity, we might say. There's some political pressures around reducing regulatory burdens. The FDTA requires a regulation. That's the SBR context that we're talking about here. And we're also framing this as SBR and FDTA reducing burdens with standardization. So I'm curious to hear from both of you how you might frame this to skeptics. We have a regulation that supports reducing regulatory burden. How do we help the skeptics understand this reduction in burden? Bridget, I want to start with you, and then we'll turn to Mark.
All right. Well, I was going to steal Mark's thunder and go right to figure B1 because it's great. It really articulates exactly where the benefits are, and I'd love to start kind of at the bottom up, and that's the reporting efficiency. You submit once to the IRS, the SEC, the EPA, Treasury. I mean, it's really taking the burden off of the entity that is reporting. So it really is, instead of like just looking straight ahead, but thinking, a little bit down the road where it's going. The real-time supervision of the regulators and auditors. Cost reduction replaces a whole bunch of different siloed individual places where you submit regulatory information. And then when you have this standard way of doing things, now you can have some enablement by the vendors in the technology world, and people can start to build new tools that can take advantage of the new standardization.
And that's well said. And there are a number of figures, I guess, as I talked about how we developed this. Not only did we start from the appendices, this was created as a storyboard. So if you look at all the figures and linked together, it was a visual storyboard of how we talked about it. It culminated here with the idea of B1, which is the whole SBR. This whole concept here is about, to Nick's point, yes, we can add things. There are different things that are going to require an increase in, let's say, operating expense to get to the data. The data offices are going to have to be challenged with this. Applications are going to need to be changed, warehouses, vendors, cloud providers, it's going to add up. The reality is for both regulators is that they need to say, okay, we understand this is a net add if you look at it from that perspective. However, here is what we envision being taken off the table. Here is what we envision simplifying your reporting process. Rather than going through one or 9 different agencies, you're going to submit once and reuse everywhere. You're going to use this common approach. And so I think the regulators from the government side need to all address that. But there's also an equal shared responsibility from the industry folks like myself to say, okay, if this is what we could do with it, and this is what the potential that Ashley, Bridget, and myself started talking about, then you have to ask yourself, okay, what do we need to do to operate differently to gain that horse running faster, to gain the efficiencies, but also to change the way we do things from the data ideation, saying, can we simplify our internal processes, decrease the operational, the financial risk, all the things that are associated with that, the reputation risk? Because guess what happens when your data is wrong from an accuracy standpoint when you submit to 9 agencies using one thing, one element? If that element is wrong, guess what? It's wrong everywhere. It's not wrong in 9 silos that you may be able to get away with. If your information is suspect, if your information is fragmented, and again, data fragmentation is the antithesis of what AI is going to require. If you are still a very highly fragmented organization and you're looking at this and saying, oh, it's just more burden, you haven't thought through your AI strategy. You haven't thought your advanced data strategy, because guess what, folks? This is going to happen and you're going to need to deal with it. It just so happens that now, if we wanted to blame the regulations, we can blame them, but we can actually use this as industry folks to our benefit and our betterment, and actually maybe reduce costs, reduce political liability, all that good stuff.
All right, last question before we wrap here. The report lays out 5 stages: awareness, design, pilots, infrastructure, and expansion or expand. If you had to pick one stage that needs the most urgent attention right now at this moment, where the gap between what needs to happen, what's actually happening is the largest, what would it be and why? Bridget, then Mark.
Okay, I'm going with design. This is on pages 29 through 33 in the white paper. And I wish Ashley was here, because she has already talked about the interagency working groups and the task forces. They're starting, and with everything going on, I'm sure the energy may have been depleted, but I think they'll pick back up as soon as we can kind of get this rule finalized. So staff interagency working groups, finish the rulemaking process and the format, identify boundaries, what's stopping us from really making this go across the board and in agreement. And then, lastly, just the secure funding. So I think we focus on design.
I
Great,
would
Mark.
agree with her wholeheartedly. I think design is the challenge. We have lots of folks that can think through the strategy. We have lots of folks that are good at the technology and the migration and the portability. But I think the real challenge here is getting a working group that not just represents the interagencies, but industry buy-in to industry participation. And we see these are the lessons learned that we can take away from Australia, take away from the Netherlands, and take away even from the EU, which is struggling, and basically say, folks, without that buy-in, without that partnership, guess what? You can define this all you want, and it's still going to be viewed as a burden. And it really doesn't take into consideration what we need as industry folks to make this something simpler and more beneficial to everybody.
Incredibly well said. I think attention on design makes a lot of sense. Mark, I'm going to pull your thread on your horse analogies and say maybe this is a time to put a bet on that horse and lean in. What an incredible conversation with both of you. Bridget and Mark, thank you for sharing your insights and your perspectives. Craig, thank you as well for opening us up and kicking us off. Special thanks to Donnelley Financial Solutions for co-hosting with us and partnering with us on this product. The report is called The Reality of SBR 2.0 Streamlined Data. We encourage you to check it out, download it off our websites, and take a closer look at the charts, at the substance. We encourage you to share your feedback with us and engage with us on the next steps, because there is an incredible amount to do on realizing the vision of the Financial Data Transparency Act. We are expecting that financial regulation in coming months, as the administration has committed to publishing it as part of the regulatory agenda. Here at the Data Foundation, we will continue to lean in with our partners and our allies, including Donnelley Financial, which is one of our executive members of the Data Coalition. To everyone out there, stay involved, stay committed, and definitely stay engaged on these important matters of data policy. There is much to do in this year and the years ahead, and we look forward to working with all of you. For those who are tuned in, thank you for joining us. We will see you soon. Onward.